Picture a battlefield. Not the abstract, sanitized kind you read out in a history textbook.
Right.
I mean, the visceral reality, the kind that leaves language struggling to keep up. Bodies pressed into the mud, broken limbs.
Just absolute, extreme, chaotic violence.
Exactly. The absolute definition of it.
Yeah, it's violence stripped of all pretense, really, operating at the very limits of human endurance and destruction.
Okay, so keep that in your head. Now, I want you to shift that scene in your mind. A completely different environment.
Okay.
Bright fluorescent lights. Stainless steel surfaces everywhere. A mechanical, rhythmic in the background. Animals moving along a conveyor system.
So an industrial slaughterhouse.
Right. There's no chaos here. There's no visible rage. It's just cold, calculated efficiency.
Yeah.
Two entirely different worlds, aesthetically speaking. But what if our legal system secretly treats them as exactly the same thing?
Which is such a wild concept to wrap your head around.
It really is. So today we're doing a deep dive into a stack of legal and philosophical texts surrounding this highly provocative framework developed by legal scholar Saskia Stuckey. It's called Animal Warfare Law.
And it is fascinating.
It is. Our mission today is to figure out if our legal system is structurally treating industrial agriculture as a literal war. And, more importantly, how realizing this might actually give us a legal blueprint to fundamentally change the system.
Right, because Stuckey's premise, it really forces us to look past the aesthetic differences of those two spaces you just described.
Yeah.
Because while a muddy trench and a sterile meatpacking plant feel morally and aesthetically unrelated, they actually share this deeply unsettling foundation.
How so?
Well, both are aranas of systemic, organized, institutionalized violence on just a massive scale.
Okay, but I have to play the skeptic here. I am genuinely skeptical, and I imagine you listening at home might be too.
Sure, yeah.
Are we literally suggesting that humans have declared a formal legal war on cows and chickens? Because, characterizing my morning eggs as an act of war sounds like a massive exaggeration.
Oh, totally. And we need to separate the literal from the structural here.
Okay.
No one is drafting a declaration of war against livestock. There are no, peace treaties waiting to be signed between humans and poultry.
Right, obviously.
The analogy we are unpacking today is purely structural. The argument is that if you take the blueprint of how international law manages human warfare, and you overlay it onto how domestic law manages animal agriculture, the architectural lines match up perfectly.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. The human legal system governs violence against animals using the exact same structural mechanisms it uses to govern violence on a human battlefield.
Okay, let's test that architecture then. Because to prove these two legal structures are identical, we have to look at the foundational rule they both share, right?
Exactly.
And in both systems, the cornerstone is this concept of, quote, unnecessary suffering.
Right. So consider international humanitarian law, which dictates the laws of war.
Okay.
The most surprising thing to note about the laws of war is that they do not actually prohibit war.
Wait, really? They don't?
No, they accept that armed conflict is a reality. The Geneva Conventions, for instance, they don't say you cannot kill.
Right, because it's a war.
Exactly. They stepped in to say, since you are going to kill, you must minimize suffering. You can't use chemical weapons. You can't cause superfluous injury.
So it's a legal framework designed entirely to regulate the methods of violence, not to stop the violence itself.
Precisely. And when you map that onto animal welfare law, the parallels start to look really eerie.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
Yeah, because animal welfare law governs how animals are farmed, transported, experimented on, and killed.
Right.
But it doesn't outlaw the use of animals. It simply says, since we are going to use them, we have to stun them before slaughter, or we have to give them a certain amount of space.
Right. Both systems hinge on this idea that you cannot cause unnecessary suffering. But wait, let's unpack that word for a second. Unnecessary.
Let's do it.
Because in human war, necessary means like bombing a supply line so an invading army doesn't overrun your country.
Sure.
But in an industrial farm, necessary means someone wants a cheaper chicken sandwich. How can the law treat those two necessities as structurally equivalent? Doesn't the word necessary imply some kind of moral high ground?
You would think so, but no. The law does something very clever and chillingly pragmatic with the definition of necessity.
Okay.
In the eyes of the law, necessary does not mean morally justified. It simply means useful for the system's underlying purpose.
Wow. Just useful.
Just useful. In war, violence is legally necessary if it achieves a military objective.
Right.
In animal agriculture, violence is legally necessary if it achieves a human benefit, whether that's food production, scientific data, or just economic profit.
So the law isn't asking, is this violence morally right?
Not at all. It is only asking, is this violence useful to the system?
So long as the suffering serves a practical utility, the law just stamps it as necessary.
Exactly.
That brings up this profound contradiction we run into in the sources, this paradox of humane violence.
Yes, the paradox.
Because we recognize that industrial agriculture involves inherently violent practices, like, confining animals in gestation crates where they can't even turn around.
Right.
Or breeding chickens to grow so fast their own legs collapse under them. But instead of abolishing these practices, we regulate them and just slap the label humane on the packaging.
And that is so dangerous. Regulating a violent act does something very profound to human psychology. It doesn't just restrain the harm, it authorizes it.
Because it makes it legal.
Right. When a violent practice becomes legally regulated, it becomes socially acceptable. It normalizes the unthinkable.
Oh, that makes total sense.
To understand the mechanism behind why we do this, the legal texts actually point us toward the philosopher David Hume.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, Hume argued that human reason is often just the slave of the passions.
Meaning our habits dictate our logic, not the other way around.
Exactly. Think about the timeline of human history. We formed the habit of using animals for food and labor long before we developed complex legal systems regarding animal sentience, right?
Right, thousands of years ago.
So according to Hume's logic, human beings enjoyed the benefits of exploiting animals. That's the passion, the habit.
Okay.
But as we became more aware of animal suffering, we felt cognitive dissonance. We felt guilty.
Sure.
To soothe that guilt, we didn't stop the habit. Instead, we retroactively invented animal welfare laws. That's the reason part. We invented them to make ourselves feel better about continuing the habit.
So we basically built a legal system to protect our own comfort.
Yes. And if you bring Friedrich Nietzsche into this, as some of these philosophical analyses do, he takes that idea even further.
What did Nietzsche say?
He essentially argued that moral systems are just strategies for managing power.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So calling an industrial slaughterhouse humane is a brilliant rhetorical trick for those holding the power.
Right, because it masks the absolute dominance humans have over the natural world.
Exactly. By focusing on tiny welfare improvements like slightly larger cages, we repackage systemic, institutionalized violence so that it doesn't disturb our cultural conscience.
The label humane treatment explicitly does not mean eliminating harm. It just means smoothing off the sharpest edges of the blade so society doesn't have to look away.
That's a perfect way to put it.
But here's my question. If regulating violence just makes it more culturally acceptable and actually stabilizes this massive system of exploitation, it seems obvious that we should just get rid of the system entirely.
Right, logically.
But we don't. And this leads us to the massive intellectual deadlock in current animal law. Because, millions of people are trying to change this, yet we are completely stuck.
We really are. The scale of animal use is only increasing globally, despite growing public concern and national statutes and international agreements.
Yeah, it's wild.
The reason we are stuck is that our legal approach is fractured into a strict binary. You have two completely opposed camps fighting over how to solve the problem, and they are deadlocked.
Okay, let's break those down. First, you have the welfare approach.
Right, the dominant model, the pragmatic path that says, well, people are going to eat meat, so let's just make the factory farms slightly less terrible.
Right, pragmatism.
But it operates entirely within a resource paradigm. It accepts that animals are property, mere commodities for human use.
So it never questions the baseline assumption.
Never. And while it occasionally secures minor improvements in living conditions, it fundamentally fails to stop the billions of deaths.
Right.
The welfare path is structurally limited because it never allows you to question whether that exploitation should exist in the first place. It just manages the fallout.
So wait, let's use an analogy to synthesize this for the listener. It sounds like animal welfare law is basically installing a state-of-the-art air conditioning system inside a burning building.
Oh, that's a great metaphor.
Like it makes the temperature slightly more tolerable for the people trapped inside, but it completely ignores the fact that the station is literally engulfed in flames.
Exactly. And then you have the alternative, which is the rights approach.
Okay.
This path demands that we put the fire out entirely. It argues that animals have intrinsic value and shouldn't be used as instruments for human benefit at all.
The abolitionist approach.
Right. The goal of the rights movement is total abolition of animal exploitation.
Morally, that sounds incredibly compelling.
It does.
But practically, it demands a fire hose that society hasn't even invented yet. I mean, it asks for a complete overnight shutdown of global industries.
And that is the trip. We are handed this normative dilemma. The welfare path is criticized as a weak compromise that stabilizes the very violence it claims to reform.
Right. It just keeps the burning building standing longer.
Yes. Meanwhile, the Reich's path is dismissed by the legal establishment as an impossible utopian dream.
So the two sides spend all their energy exposing the flaws in each other's logic, and it results in a total legislative stalemate.
Exactly. We are forced to choose between the air conditioning or a magical fire extinguisher that doesn't exist.
But the reason we're stuck isn't because one side is inherently wrong, right? It's because the either-or structure of the debate is completely flawed.
Precisely. And to break this deadlock, Stuckey's framework forces us to look back at the human laws of war to see the critical missing piece in our legal architecture.
Okay, tell me about the human laws of war. How do they work?
Let's look at the history of human international law. Modern legal frameworks for war do not just consist of one layer.
Right.
They divide the problem of armed conflict into three distinct interconnected layers. We already discussed the first layer.
The law of war conduct.
Right, international humanitarian law. That regulates how the violence is fought once a war has already started.
Okay.
But then you have the second layers, known as jus contra bellum, the law against war.
Ah, okay. This was the massive shift after World War II, right?
Precisely the mechanism we need to look at. Before 1945, war was largely seen as a legitimate tool of statecraft.
Like, if a country wanted territory, it could just declare war.
Right, exactly. But the creation of the United Nations Charter fundamentally changed the rules. It established jus contra bellum, a legal framework designed to restrict the use of force and prevent the initiation of conflict entirely.
So under modern international law, a state cannot just invade another. The use of force is generally only legally justified in strict self-defense.
Exactly. So the first layer regulates the war, the second layer prevents the war. And there's a third layer, too.
What's the third?
The law of peace, human rights law.
Oh.
This governs life outside of armed conflict. It defines dignity, freedom, and the baseline requirements for how we live together without violence.
So when you look at human law, you see a complete triadic structure. You regulate the violence, prevent the violence, define the peace.
Yes. But when you look at the architecture of animal law,
it's missing the top two floors.
Exactly. Animal law only operates inside the quote-unquote war on animals. It only has that first layer.
Animal welfare law, just regulating the harm.
Right. It completely lacks a jus contra bellum to prevent the exploitation from starting, and it lacks a framework for peaceful coexistence.
Oh, wow.
We are trying to solve a systemic global crisis using only a fraction of the legal tools we developed for human conflict.
That makes so much sense. We never had our 1945 moment for animals. We never built the law that questions the onset of the violence.
No, we didn't. So Saskia Stuckey proposes we build it. If human law has jus contra bellum, animal law needs jus animalis contra bellum, an animal anti-war law.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. But I need to see this in reality.
Sure.
This sounds great in theory, but what does an anti-war law for animals look like on a random Tuesday?
Well, it's a proactive legal layer designed to strictly limit when and why animals are used at all.
Okay.
It shifts the entire legal focus from merely managing violence to actively reducing and preventing it. You stop reacting to the suffering caused by the exploitation, and you start legally questioning the exploitation itself.
Okay, let's make this tangible for the listener. Look at a carton of eggs in your fridge.
Yeah.
Under the old system, animal welfare law, the only legal question we asked was, how big was the cage the chicken was kept in?
Right.
How does this new animal anti-war law change the reality of that carton of eggs?
It changes the fundamental legal test. Jus animalis contra bellum would implement a strict structural necessity test.
Structural necessity, okay.
Instead of asking, was the suffering inside the cage unnecessary, the law asks, is the cage itself necessary?
Oh, that's completely different.
Right. Or even broader, is the practice of industrialized egg production actually necessary for human survivals and flourishing in the 21st century?
That is a tectonic shift. You aren't adjusting the temperature of the burning building anymore. You are evaluating whether we need to be in the building at all.
And when you apply that test, things like extreme confinement fail immediately.
Because it's not strictly necessary.
Legally, you could justify banning factory farming entirely under this framework because it fails that test. But it goes deeper than just bans.
What else does it do?
An anti-war framework involves the state actively organizing a structural transition.
Oh, right. Because if a country legally declares that it's moving away from a war footing, it has to convert its wartime economy into a peacetime economy.
Exactly the same principle. Jus animalis contra bellum would require state-funded transition policies.
So, like redirecting agricultural subsidies.
Yes, taking money away from factory farming and pouring those resources into alternative proteins, plant-based food systems, and helping farmers transition their livelihoods.
Wow.
You systematically replace the industries of harm over time.
So we have welfare law managing the reality of the present. We introduce this new middle layer, the anti-war law, to actively prevent future harm and physically transition the economy.
Right.
With those two in place, we can finally construct the complete legal system. Which brings us back to the rights approach.
Exactly. Animal rights completely changed their function in this triadic model.
They do.
Yes, they're no longer positioned as an all-or-nothing utopian alternative to welfare. In a three-tiered system, animal rights become the law of peace.
Oh, they become the third floor.
Yes.
So animal rights aren't this unrealistic cliff we have to jump off tomorrow. They are the North Star.
Beautifully put.
They define the destination, while the anti-war law is the actual vehicle driving us there.
This model solves the deadlock by acknowledging how legal transformation actually happens over time. Welfare manages the present crisis. The anti-war law builds the transition. And animal rights define what a PC relationship with animals actually looks like once the transition is complete.
It provides a legal framework for recognizing their intrinsic value.
And protecting their fundamental interests.
But, I think we need to define what peace actually means in this context.
Fair point.
Because a skeptic could easily dismiss this by saying, look, nature is violent. Animals eat each other in the wild.
Sure.
Total zero harm peace is a Disney movie fairy tale. It's biologically impossible.
And they would be right. Complete absence of harm is impossible in any shared ecosystem. Human life inherently involves interaction, resource use, and dependency.
Right.
Peace in this legal framework does not mean a magical utopia. That means peaceful coexistence.
Okay, so it's about the structure of the relationship, not the total elimination of conflict.
Think about human rights. Human rights law doesn't guarantee that no human will ever be harmed by another.
Right, crime still happens.
Exactly. But it guarantees that the state will not institutionalize that harm.
Oh, that makes perfect sense.
For animals, peaceful coexistence is a relationship structure focused on actively minimizing harm, respecting their interests, and limiting our domination over them.
Okay.
It acknowledges that while we share a world where conflicts of interest happen, we absolutely do not need to institutionalize violence in factories to survive.
So this triadic model replaces the old dualism, the fight between welfare and rights, with complementarity.
Yes.
You no longer have to choose between realism and idealism. You use realism for today, you build the transition with the anti-war law for tomorrow, and you aim for the idealism of rights for the future.
Exactly.
It's an incredibly hopeful blueprint. Even if dismantling industries built on billions of animals is going to be an agonizingly slow struggle against institutional inertia.
True, but we are already seeing the first cracks in that inertia.
Are we?
Oh, yeah. The massive influx of capital into alternative food systems, the growing public rejection of intensive farming, and incremental legal innovations recognizing animal sentience.
Right.
These are early indicators of structural change. We are slowly shifting the paradigm from managing violence to actively transcending it.
Wow. Okay, let's recap this incredible journey of a deep dive. We started with the deeply disturbing reality of comparing an industrial slaughterhouse to a human battlefield.
We did.
We unpacked the paradox of humane violence and saw how the law could be used to authorize our darkest habits. We looked at the paralyzing trap between the air conditioning of welfare and the distant fire hose of rights.
Yeah.
But ultimately, we found a blueprint, a missing middle layer of law that bridges the gap and builds an actual functioning animal law of peace.
And the takeaway for the listener here is that this structural shift isn't merely an academic exercise for legal scholars.
No.
It is a civilizational question. It asks how a society decides to move past systems that rely on normalized absolute violence.
Right.
Historically, human societies have had to legally dismantle justified systems of exploitation, like colonial domination, for example.
Right.
We are now facing the challenge of radically rethinking our legal relationship with the rest of the natural world.
It's not just a debate over legal codes. It's a question about what kind of world we want to inhabit. And that leaves us with a final thought to mull over for you listening at home.
Yeah.
If our legal systems are ultimately just a reflection of our collective habits and our cultural blind spots.
Just as human nature warned us.
Exactly. Then what everyday totally normalized violence in your own life right now will future generations look back on as an unthinkable state of war. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the structures around you.